So you might not know anyone that has TPS or any Salvadorans, but there are people that do enjoy the cuisine, and this might help them better understand what is at stake and what might be lost when hundreds and thousands of people might be forced to leave this country.
I'm your host, Joy Manning, and this is Edible Potluck, a podcast that gives food lovers a taste of Edible Communities magazines. Today, we're off to Queens, New York for a conversation with photographer and writer Salvador Espinoza about where politics meet pupusas. Then we're stopping by Indianapolis to talk to blogger Sonja Overhiser about a group she helped start there for women on the food scene. But before we get going, I wanted to tell you about a recipe I just tried. It's for chickpea popovers. These are gluten-free, fast, easy, and delicious. I don't normally go in for a gluten-free version of a classic, but I am a huge fan of chickpea flour. Chickpea flour is just a flour made by finely grinding dried chickpeas, in case you never heard of it. Sometimes it's labeled garbanzo flour, and it's available pretty much everywhere. It makes delicious, savory crepes and pancakes. Anyway, in this recipe, it just replaces the usual white flour you find in a popover. But it's more about the interesting, savory flavor than avoiding gluten or something healthy like that. This isn't health food. There's plenty of butter. You just blitz a few eggs, milk, the chickpea flour, and salt in the blender, and then pour the batter into buttery muffin tins. You start them in a very hot oven, and that's how you get a trademark puffy pop over the rim of the muffin tin, and then you crank it down to finish the baking at a lower temperature. These make a great snack, and they would be wonderful as the base for something like sausage and gravy, if you ask me. You can find the recipe at ediblecommunities.com. Bake them for yourself and tell me what you think. I love reading all the edible magazines, and I try not to play favorites. But I have to admit to being especially excited to get my hands on Edible Queens. For me, it's the many immigrant food communities there that make it such an exciting place to visit, or even just read about. Thanks to this diversity, the Queens food scene provides a lens to look beyond restaurants and recipes to important political and policy issues. For example, later this year, temporary protected status, a special status granted to people from certain countries for certain reasons, will end for people from El Salvador. There are many causes for concern here, including the way this change will impact small businesses, especially food businesses. It's a shift that threatens the many pupusa spots that have thrived in Queens since temporary protected status was granted to Salvadorian immigrants. Edible Queens contributor Salvador Espinoza covers this story in his article, Politics and Pupusas, and he's here to talk to us about it today. Thank you for being with us, Salvador.
Thank you for having me, Joy. Looking forward to speaking with you.
This is a little bit of a heavy topic, but I thought we could start on a lighter note. For those who haven't had the pleasure of eating a pupusa in their life, could you describe one?
Sure. So a pupusa is a corn-stuffed tortilla with, usually it's either with pork chicharrón, which is fried pork chunks, or beans or cheese. And then there are revueltas, which are the more popular ones that are just stuffed with all three. And now increasingly here in the States, people have been experimenting more. So you'll see something like ham and cheese pupusas or chicken pupusas or jalapeno stuffed pupusas. So there's a bit of experimentation going on with them now in the States it's being mixed with American food. But traditionally it's cheese, beans, and pork chunks. And it's pretty savory, pretty, most of it tends to be pretty cheesy. And somehow the best ones are crispy and soft at the same time. So it's something that's comfort food for Salvadorans and for people getting into Salvadoran cuisine. It's a good entry point.
It's not one of those things that's an acquired taste. It's pretty hard not to like.
Yeah, exactly. They're pretty similar. I mean, if people are familiar with gorditas, which are Mexican food, that's sort of similar. The only difference is gorditas are stuffed after, and pupusas are actually mixed in. The cheese and the beans are mixed in when you put the patty on the griddle.
So, I mean, it's a pretty delicious thing to worry about losing in a community. So I'm wondering, besides your, appreciation of the food, how did this story come to your attention, and what made you want to cover it?
Well, being Salvadoran American, I grew up frequenting a lot of these Salvadoran restaurants, and then also having family and friends that some are under TPS. I wanted to sort of frame the story of TPS and what might happen to people with TPS once it gets revoked. And I think food is universal, and food is an entry point into other people's culture. And though you might not know anyone that has TPS or any Salvadorans, but there are people that do enjoy the cuisine, and this might help them better understand what is at stake and what might be lost when hundreds and thousands of people might be forced to leave this country. So that really gave me a desire to kind of put this story out there now, being that TPS has been revoked recently and people are in danger of having to be sent back home at the end of 2019.
So what will basically happen, and I
Right.
believe it's September when it will be revoked, will people either choose to leave the country, or will they pass from being legal to being
Yeah,
undocumented?
right now it's
Is that your
still in
sense of it?
appeals. Recently, I believe in October, they sent another appeal. And as of now, it still stands September 2019. But the hope is that it might get pushed back to 2020 or even more. And that way, people would be able to either apply for residency or any other pathway to be able to stay here. But if it does get revoked, there are tons of people that are in danger of being deported. And that's, a large majority of people with TPS have been here for, close to 20 years and have owned homes, owned businesses, and they might be deported and just have to just leave everything that they built in the last 20 years.
It is a long time frame that you're talking about here, and you say that back in the 70s, before we saw so much immigration from El Salvador, that it was hard to find pupusas in Queens. Can you sort of explain the things that changed? It wasn't just the temporary protected status,
Right.
right?
So in the 70s, there weren't as many Salvadorans or Central Americans on the East Coast. And then during the 80s, during the Civil War in El Salvador, as well as unrest in nearby places like Nicaragua and Honduras, there was a large migration of Central Americans to the East Coast of New York. And along with that came people opening up their own Salvadorian Central American restaurants. And that was through the 80s and 90s. And then you started seeing a large amount of Central Americans in these neighborhoods. And then a further bigger wave of migration in the early 2000s due to hurricanes and earthquakes that just decimated large parts of the country.
So, do you know exactly when TPS was
It was
granted?
I believe it was after Hurricane Mitch and a couple of earthquakes in I want to say the mid 2000, late 2000.
And my understanding is a natural disaster is a common reason why this status is granted to a
Right.
group of
So
people.
TPS right now isn't just El Salvador, but it's other countries. So Haiti is also under, a lot of Haitians are under TPS, Nepal, Yemen, Sudan. So there's a good, I believe, not sure the exact number, but I believe it's around 9 countries that have TPS status. And it is natural disasters are a huge part of why people are granted TPS. Also, if people are in danger, dangerous conditions such as war and etc. But what's interesting is that these countries such as El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras, they're still very much under threat of civil unrest and gang violence. So TPS being revoked and them going back puts them in danger as well. And this is why you see people, this caravan of people coming up because they're fleeing pretty dangerous conditions there right now.
I think it's in what most people think of when they think of the American spirit to welcome people from places that are really in hard conditions with like war or natural disasters. I just doesn't seem like the type of thing that Americans would want, the status being denied these people. And I actually learned about it through your article, so I'm very grateful for that because now I'm aware of it. And I think that maybe other people who are reading food magazines, perhaps more than the news, will, have the same experience I did learning about it. In the article, you say that pupusa shops are more than just restaurants. They're places where community is built. They're community hubs. Can you give us some examples of how they build that
Sure.
community?
There's a big way for people to get into the restaurant business or finding their first job when they get here is through these restaurants. They might know a family member or friends that have worked there before, or they might know the owners. And this is how they start off, starting to get into the business, starting to work here. There's also a place where if you don't know anyone and you might know someone in the neighborhood, or you might just go up to the restaurant, it might be the only area that they speak your language, they know where you're from, and they start building a community around it. So you can go there and get information. And once people are settled here, it becomes a familiar place to go eat. So after they've been here a while, as such as with my family, we'd go to these places to celebrate a birthday, or sometimes in not so happy circumstances, if someone passes away, we go out and eat at these restaurants. And there's also, from one of the restaurants that I covered, named El Rincon, she told me a great story about this lifelong patron that was there and pretty much became family to them. I think he was there since the beginning. And a couple years ago, he passed away, and he pretty much passed away without any money. But they covered his expenses, and they pretty much covered everything for him, and were able to send him back to El Salvador, and they covered that for him as well. So this is kind of like the community that gets built around these restaurants.
That's really
Yeah, so
incredible.
it's not just a place where to eat, but you can find a familiar face, people that speak familiar language, and taste food back home. It's the only place people feel at home at when they get here.
Now, you write that this decision, just the news that this is going to happen, is already affecting the small businesses, the food businesses, like the
Hmm.
pupusa shops
Yeah.
and restaurants. Can you explain how they're being affected now and why, in advance of it even happening, that's
Yeah.
impacting them?
So when I spoke to a couple of these restaurants, I asked them about, if have they seen any changes, and they said definitely. I mean, even before it got put into effect, and there was, these talks of it happening, people were terrified. One, because they're not sure how this would be put into play. Were they just going to be rounded up, and were they just going to go into these places where Salvadorans and Central Americans are known to frequent, um, and just get taken away? And then the other fear was they needed to save as much money as they could because they're not sure what their future holds. So they saw a sharp decline in some cases from 25 to 40% of people stopping frequenting these places. So they've seen a large number of their business go down a bit. Now I think it's settled down a bit, and people are not as scared and are kind of feeling it out, and business is coming back slowly. But once those rumors and those everything hit the news, they definitely saw that sharp decline.
Do you expect some of these restaurants might have to close?
I don't think so. I think these restaurants, particularly these three that are here, they've been here for 30 years in most cases. Newer ones might have a harder time staying open. Um, but the particular three that are covered, they've been through a lot, and they've been fighting to stay open for a while. So I think they're okay, but it's still touch and go. Um, but we'll see. I mean, hopefully they've been through a lot before, and as one Don Armando, one of them said, he said, we went through struggles before, as not just the restaurant, but as people, but we'll be here, and that's just the way that they got to march on.
We talked a little bit about the other communities that this will be affecting. As someone who covers food in Queens, do you expect similar things to happen in other parts of the food scene? Have you heard anything
I
about that?
haven't, but I can imagine there is a big community in the last few years of Nepali people that are over in Sunnyside and Woodside, and there are pockets of restaurants around there as well, so that they might be affected, and also the other Central American restaurants in the area, since you have Nicaraguan and Hondurans also affected by TPS. And you're also looking at, Haitians are on the TPS, so you might see some of that affected. But I think Nepali having a real concentrated area in Queens, that might be a place that might be affected. And because
So this is a good time to support your favorite immigrant-owned restaurants in Queens if you've never tried them or if you want to keep them in business. It seems extra important
definitely,
to support
definitely
them
right
with
now at this
dollars.
moment. And I think not just now but always, these restaurants are a reflection of the American dream. I mean, a lot of these owners came here without pretty much anything, started working in kitchens, either as barbacks, busboys, or line cooks, and gradually learned the business and came to own their business. And now, like, Doña Elena, who owns El Rincon, her sons are owners of their own establishment. They were born here, but they learned the business from her. They opened a cafe not too far from El Rincon that serves smoothies and different healthy foods. And uh, the woman that owns Salvatoria Bar in Astoria is the daughter of a woman that owned a restaurant in Jackson Heights. So you see different generations of Salvadorans. So this is a reflection of the American dream of what is ideal. You start working, you put your work in, and you're able to own the business and have your kids also progress along and have them own their own businesses. So yeah, it's definitely, it's time to support, but always keep in mind that this is what keeps America going. And yeah.
In addition to writing this article, you also photographed it. And I think the photos, especially the portraits when we're seeing people's faces, really show your connection to this story and that you understand it and what's at stake here. I was wondering, do you consider yourself mostly a writer or mostly a photographer? And how does one inform the other as you work?
I'm definitely more of a photographer and only more recently started writing more. Um, I think through photographing stories like this, it inspires me to write more. I think I can only do so much with photography, and I want to get deeper into the story and deeper into the lives of people. And this writing is a way to connect on a deeper level with the audience, and give them more information and give them more of the story. But definitely, I consider myself a photographer first. But it is pretty exciting to start to write. It's a whole nother avenue to learn, and it's a whole way that I can express myself and get these stories out there more. So
Well, I really enjoyed the story, and thank you so much for writing it, and thank you for talking to me today.
yeah, thank you so much, sir.
That was Salvador Espinoza, a photographer and writer born, raised, and still based in Long Island City, Queens. His work has been published in the New York Times, Mass Appeal, and Frontrunner magazine, among others. We'll have a link to his article in the show notes for this episode. Sonja Overhiser is a writer and recipe developer focused on easy, healthy home cooking. Her cookbook, Pretty Simple Cooking, was one of our favorites from last year. You might also know her from her hugely popular food blog, A Couple Cooks. Today she's here to talk about Indie Women in Food, an organization she co-founded to kickstart collaborations and provide support for women on the Indianapolis food scene. Welcome, Sonja. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Joy.
I read about your group in Edible Indie, and I was totally intrigued, partially because we're seeing groups like this pop up around the country. We even have one in Philadelphia, so I have a special interest in the story. And I was hoping that you could start just by telling me how Indie Women in Food came to exist as a group.
Sure. So it was kind of an accident. It was not something that my co-founder Ashley or I were really planning, but we had an event here in Indianapolis a couple years ago now. Carrie Diamond from Cherry Bomb came and moderated a panel of women working in food in Indianapolis, and I was one of the panelists. And that panel discussion, there was a great attendance, and there was just this energy in the room of women who are really excited about hearing about other women working in the food industry. And people were saying, we've never gotten together like this before. There should be a way that we can continue these connections. And so afterwards, Ashley and I both had this idea of what if we started something, but we didn't know each other. And a friend of ours connected us and said, you guys are both thinking of the same thing right now. So we had a coffee date and decided, hey, let's start a network that can connect these women working in the food industry in Indianapolis so that we can help each other, we can champion each other's causes.
Now, your background is as a food writer and a blogger and a cookbook author. Can you tell us a little more about Ashley?
Sure. She's in the restaurant industry. She helped to co-found a really famous indie restaurant. Now it's called Milktooth. And she also started a farmer's market. And she's very much from the side of restaurants and growing and producing food. And then I'm kind of in the food media sector. So that was helpful for us we have very different contacts, and we wanted to have a place where it didn't matter what type of way that you were working in food, be it restaurants or food media or any type of food photography, farming, urban farming, any career that touched food, that we could have a place that we could all join together.
I'm a little surprised to hear you weren't friends first and that you met because you both had the same idea. What was that first coffee date like? Did you have like friend chemistry?
We did. We hit it off right away. And the cool thing is that we both really have complementary skill sets. So where one of us might be needing kind of a boost in one area, we can really complement each other. So it worked out perfectly, luckily.
So why did you both think this was something that you needed in the indie food scene?
Yeah, I think the indie food scene was pretty disconnected back then, and there are still disconnects in lots of different areas. But we just felt we needed a stronger community that could really collaborate together. And that's why we started the group. It just started out as a Facebook group, actually. And it was a place where women could come and say, hey, I'm having this challenge. Could someone help to connect me to someone? And in that group, we really saw a spirit of collaboration blossom where people would say, hey, I have these like herb starts that I'm growing. Where can I sell them? And someone would chime in and say, hey, I have this perfect place where you can sell them. And so we've seen that happen time and time again, of being able to connect and collaborate and create a better food world here in Indianapolis by just being able to talk to each other in a common space.
How long has the group been in existence?
So we founded Indie Women in Food in June of 2017. So it's pretty a short time that we've been around.
Yeah, ours is new too in Philly. We were definitely less than a year old. You mentioned that the kind of things that were happening in the Facebook group if someone would come with the plant starters, where to sell them. Do you have any other examples of collaborations that have come out of that conversation?
Sure. Well, actually, I can mention that we have also started doing some events around town. So we've really tried to grow as our network grows organically and try to understand what women are looking for. And we had a few women in our group that had a passion about having a conversation about diversity in food and the food scene here in Indianapolis. And so we decided to have a panel discussion, and we just 1 week ago had this discussion, even less than a week ago, had an event, a panel event to discuss diverse women working in the food industry in Indianapolis. And it was an incredible event. And we had some industry leader men chefs in the audience who were listening to what these women had to say. And right after that event, we had several of them reach out and ask if we had any women in our group that were looking for jobs in the restaurant industry. And so it was just really a cool thing to see the community kind of rallying around us, and then having the already established male chefs in Indy to really be listening to that message and coming to us.
That's so interesting. We recently had, through Edible Philly and our own sort of Philly Women in Food group, had an event that was focused on women in food. And we thought about making it just for women, but we didn't. We opened it up to everyone. And there were a few men there. And when it came to questions and answers and sort of talking from the group, we were surprised to see the men do a lot of talking. So we were wondering if maybe next time we should invite men, but ask them to, let the women speak. So I'm wondering, what was your event like? Did the men talk during the event, or were they mostly listening?
No, the men were mostly listening, and it was really, really cool to see. We said the event was open for all, and it was just it was so gratifying to see men there and hear them listening. And then have them respond afterwards. And it was a forum for women to just have their voices heard.
And that happened organically. You didn't put anything in place.
Yeah.
Bravo to those indie chefs.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So you have this Facebook group, and now you're also doing these in-person events. What kind of networking happens in real life versus online? How does that connection differ?
Yeah, we love having in-person events, and we've done some potlucks with our Indie Women in Food core group of women. The event that I was talking about was open to the public. That was our first really public-facing event. But we do have some internal potluck events. And oh my goodness, I mean, being able to meet up in person, several of us with some of our kind of like rock star women chef idols is such a beautiful experience, and being able to really share life and talk in person about our passions and our dreams for the indie food scene. The in-person meetups are really where it happens.
Who are those rock star idols that you're mentioning, if you feel like you can tell us who they are?
Sure. So Regina Mahalik of Our Bistro is now closed, but Our Bistro was one of the first really flagship farm-to-table restaurants here in Indianapolis. I started learning about food going to Our Bistro about 10 years ago, and that was where I really discovered like how amazing farm-to-table food could be. So the head chef of that restaurant is in our group. Another chef, Becky Hostetter of the restaurant Duos, an incredible vegetarian chef. She's like the best in her league here in Indianapolis. So it's been so fun for me to have admired these women from afar and then have them as part of this group.
When you say there's a core group, about how many are in the potluck core group?
Well, our Indie Women in Food group, if we're judging by the Facebook group, which is our kind of the only place we have membership right now, we have about 160 women, but not all of them are at the potluck. So everyone is involved in a different way right now.
So the core group is like pretty small, can gather around a table?
It just depends. It really depends on kind of the timing and the time of year. We've had one potluck with maybe 50 women, and then we've had others with maybe 20. So it just depends.
I think that's a big potluck.
Yeah, we've had some really large ones.
So you have yourself in food media, and I'm sure there's other people in the food media in your group, chefs that we talked about. What other type of occupations in the food world are represented in Indie Women in Food?
Yeah, so we have food bloggers, we have reporters, we have radio show hosts, we have urban farmers, we have people working for the city more as like community planner type people. We have all sorts of people who fit into different food categories, and then some who are a little more tangentially related, maybe on the board of a local charity, that kind of thing, but are really just passionate about food.
Are you planning anything at the moment that you're excited about and can talk about?
We are still kind of in the works for 2019. Our diversity potluck went so well, and so many people were saying, when is the next one? That I think we're going to really have to decide how we're going to continue the momentum from that one. We did have a request about examining diverse women in food from the grower and seller perspective. So farming and grocery store. And I think that would be fabulous. We had already been thinking about doing something about women in farming for 2019. So I think that will be on the docket.
That sounds really interesting. I almost wish that Indianapolis were closer so I could drive there and come to a potluck.
I know. I was going to say, we would love to have you. So if you ever are in the Indianapolis area, we would love to invite you to an event.
Barring that, though, what advice do you have for me or others who want to start a women in food group in their own city?
I think it's not as hard as you would imagine. We just kind of started and said, we're going to start really small. We're going to start as a Facebook group, and you can do it using any technology that provides an online forum for people to chat and share ideas. So it doesn't have to be Facebook, but it was pretty simple to start that part, and just kind of we started gauging and listening. What are these women wanting and needing? And most people just really wanted connection in a space where they could connect to these other women. So I would say start small and then really listen to your community and decide what it needs. We've, kind of toyed with, okay, what do we want for the future with this group? We've been asked, do you want to become a nonprofit? And there are so many different things that we could do, but we really want to grow organically and listen to what the community needs, and not create it into something that isn't helpful in serving the needs of our community.
Well, I think that's very inspiring, whether you work in food or you're trying to build community in any other aspect of your life. I think there's a lot that we can learn from looking at groups like yours. Well, thanks again for being with us today, Sonja. It was really great to talk to you.
Absolutely. So happy to be here.
That was Sonja Overhiser. You can read more about the Indie Women in Food Group in Edible Indie, and we'll link to that article in the show notes for this episode. If you want to hear more from Sonja, check out her new podcast, Small Bites. You can also keep up with her on Instagram at @cookbook. Thank you for joining us today on Edible Potluck. Our podcast producer is David Wolf. If you like this episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to leave us a rating or a review. You know it helps other listeners find the podcast. Don't forget to pick up a copy of your own local edible magazine. If you don't know where to get one, find out at ediblecommunities.com. You can find links to everything we talked about today in the show notes for this episode at ediblecommunities.com/podcast. Until next time, remember, eat local.